Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff. Below you, the abyss. Behind you, the life you've always known. Safe, predictable, comfortable in its familiarity. But something's wrong. That comfort has become a prison, that safety, a slow death. You feel it in those quiet moments between distractions. The nagging sense that you're living someone else's script. Following rules you never consciously chose. Measuring yourself against standards you didn't create. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this coming over a century ago. He recognized the invisible chains we forge for ourselves, not physical restraints, but something far more insidious. Self-imposed weakness disguised as virtue. "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," he famously wrote. But what he discovered in his final works was something deeper, a fundamental principle so threatening to the established order that it's been systematically buried, distorted, and misunderstood. Today, we uncover Nietzsche's final rule, the key to never being weak again. Not through dominating others, but through the hardest battle you'll ever fight. The war against your own internalized slavery. Are you ready to look into the abyss? Because once you see what Nietzsche saw, you can never unsee it again. Friedrich Nietzsche was no ordinary philosopher. While his contemporaries built abstract systems from the comfort of academic chairs, Nietzsche wrote with his blood. Plagued by excruciating physical illness throughout his life, he turned his suffering into a laboratory for understanding human psychology at its deepest levels. What emerged from this crucible was his most profound insight, what we might call Nietzsche's final rule: master ressentiment, or forever remain a slave. Ressentiment. It's a French term Nietzsche deliberately used because no German or English word quite captured the poisonous psychological mechanism he'd identified. More than simple resentment, ressentiment is a complex emotional pattern that fundamentally alters how you see yourself and the world. Here's how it works. When you encounter obstacles, suffer injuries, or face people with greater power, you have two possible responses. The first is the healthy one. You acknowledge the pain, process it, and use it as fuel for growth. The second response, ressentiment, is the psychological equivalent of an autoimmune disease. In ressentiment, you cannot consciously admit your feelings of inferiority, weakness, or envy. These emotions are too threatening to your self-image. So instead of processing them, you transform them. Your conscious mind performs an alchemical trick, turning your weakness into a virtue and others' strength into a vice. "I'm not weak," you tell yourself. "I'm morally superior for not being like them." This isn't just sour grapes. It's a complete inversion of values. What you cannot have or cannot be becomes evil in your eyes. Those who possess what you secretly desire become villains in your personal narrative. Nietzsche traced this psychological mechanism throughout Western history. His most controversial work, On the Genealogy of Morals, argued that entire moral systems have been built on this foundation of ressentiment. Consider his analysis of how good and evil replaced good and bad as ethical categories. Originally, Nietzsche argued, the powerful simply described themselves and their actions as good, and what was different from them as bad, a non-moral distinction similar to how we might distinguish useful from not useful. But those who lacked power couldn't admit their resentment of the strong. Instead, they created a new dichotomy. Good, meaning humble, meek, self-sacrificing, conveniently the traits they already possessed, versus evil, meaning proud, strong, self-affirming, the traits they secretly envied but couldn't attain. This, for Nietzsche, was the slave revolt in morality, a psychological coup d'etat where weakness rebranded itself as moral superiority. The slaves didn't overcome their masters physically. They did something far more effective. They made the masters ashamed of their own strength. But here's the critical point. Nietzsche wasn't advocating a return to master morality or crude domination. His insight runs deeper. He recognized that both master and slave moralities were reactions. Neither represented genuine self-determination or authentic values. Nietzsche's final rule, master resentment or remain a slave, isn't about dominating others. It's about refusing to let your actions be determined by reaction to others. It's about creating values rather than merely inverting existing ones. The truly strong person, in Nietzsche's view, isn't the one who exerts power over others. It's the one who has overcome their own tendency toward resentment. The one who can face their own weaknesses without self-deception. The one who can create meaning rather than merely reacting against what exists. This is what Nietzsche called the will to power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The capacity to determine your own values rather than having them determined by reaction to what you fear, envy, or resent. The person who masters resentment achieves what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. They can affirm life exactly as it is, including its suffering, without needing to invent comforting fictions or blame others for their condition. They can say yes to life in its entirety, rather than living in perpetual reaction and denial. Why is this so difficult? Because resentment operates largely unconsciously. You don't know you're doing it. You sincerely believe your judgments arise from objective moral principles rather than from psychological compensation for feelings of inadequacy. This is why Nietzsche wrote that there are no moral phenomena, only moral interpretations of phenomena. The person caught in resentment cannot see that their moral judgments are symptoms of their psychology rather than perceptions of objective reality. The first step toward mastering resentment is simply recognizing its operation in yourself. This requires brutal honesty, what Nietzsche called intellectual conscience, the willingness to question your own certainties and examine the psychological origins of your values. This is where most people falter. It's easier to remain righteous in your judgments, comfortable in your moral certainties, than to ask the disturbing question, what in me needs this belief to be true? What weakness am I trying to transform or conceal? Those who manage this self-examination discover something shocking. Much of what they considered their authentic self, their deepest values, their moral intuitions, their sense of identity, was constructed reactively. It was not freely chosen, but formed in response to external pressures, childhood wounds, social expectations, and unconscious envy. This realization can trigger what Nietzsche called the Great Noon, a moment of perfect clarity where illusions fall away and you see the task before you, to move beyond reaction into genuine creation, to determine your own values rather than having them determined by what you oppose. This is Nietzsche's final rule in its fullest expression. Master resentment, the unconscious transformation of weakness into virtue and strength into vice, or forever remain a slave to your own unacknowledged psychological mechanisms. But how does this play out in our modern world? How does resentment operate in your daily life, your relationships, your politics, your consumption patterns? Let's explore the practical applications of Nietzsche's insight. Resentment isn't just an abstract philosophical concept. It's operating right now in virtually every aspect of your life, often without your awareness. Let's look at how this hidden mechanism shapes our modern world. Start with social media, perhaps the most perfect expression of resentment ever created. What drives so much online behavior? Look beneath the surface, and you'll find the exact pattern Nietzsche identified: the transformation of envy into moral superiority. When you scroll through carefully curated images of others' seemingly perfect lives, What emotions arise? For many, it's a complex mix of inadequacy, envy, and resentment. But these feelings are threatening to your self-image. So instead of acknowledging, "I'm jealous of what they have," you find moral flaws in their display. They're so materialistic. They're superficial. They're just seeking validation. This isn't conscious dishonesty. You genuinely believe your judgment is based on moral principles rather than psychological compensation for feelings of inadequacy. This is resentment in its purest form. Or consider cancel culture. Regardless of your political orientation, what often begins as legitimate moral concern frequently transforms into something else entirely: the intoxicating rush of collective moral superiority. The transgressor becomes not just someone who made a mistake, but an evil other whose complete excommunication confirms the righteousness of the group. Nietzsche would see this not as moral progress, but as resentment finding a socially sanctioned outlet. The underlying psychological pattern remains the same: the transformation of powerlessness into moral superiority. This doesn't mean all moral judgments stem from resentment. Nietzsche's point is subtler. We must question the psychological origins of our judgments rather than assuming they come from pure moral insight. Consider your relationship with work and productivity. Our culture celebrates the hustle, constant productivity, as a virtue in itself. But Nietzsche would ask, what drives this obsession? Is it genuine creation and self-expression, or is it reaction to fear? Fear of insignificance, fear of scarcity, fear of not measuring up to others. For many, productivity becomes a form of resentment against life itself, against the fundamental uncertainty of existence. Unable to accept this uncertainty, we transform it into something we can control: measurable achievement. We make a virtue of business to avoid confronting the abyss of meaning. Or examine your consumption patterns. Why do you want the things you want? Nietzsche would suggest that much of what you desire isn't chosen freely, but is reactive. You want things because others have them, because advertising has created artificial scarcity in your psychology, because possession temporarily soothes feelings of inadequacy. When you click "Buy Now" on that product you don't need, you're often acting from resentment, compensating for a felt lack by temporarily filling it with a purchase. The momentary dopamine hit from acquisition masks the deeper issue. You're reacting to lack rather than creating from fullness. Even fitness and wellness culture reveals the operation of resentment. What begins as genuine care for health often transforms into something else: the moral superiority of the disciplined over the undisciplined. The person who posts their workout routine or restrictive diet isn't just sharing information. They're often engaging in a subtle form of status display that transforms physical attributes into moral virtues. Political identity perhaps most clearly reveals resentment in action. Notice how both the right and left construct their identities not primarily around what they affirm, but around what they oppose. Each side defines itself against the perceived moral failings of the other, each convinced of its superior virtue. This is precisely the pattern Nietzsche identified: the transformation of political opposition into moral categories of good and evil. Both sides engage in what he would call slave morality, defining themselves reactively against an enemy rather than creating values affirmatively. This doesn't mean all political commitments stem from resentment, but it suggests that when political identity becomes primarily reactive, defined by what you oppose rather than what you create, it's likely operating from the psychological mechanism Nietzsche identified. Even your intimate relationships can be governed by resentment. Consider how often conflicts between partners transform from specific issues into moral judgments. "You didn't do the dishes" becomes "you're selfish and inconsiderate." Each partner casts themselves as morally superior while viewing the other's behavior as a character flaw. This transformation of practical problems into moral judgments is resentment in action. Unable to directly address feelings of hurt or disappointment, you elevate yourself by diminishing the other. The result isn't resolution, but perpetual conflict, each partner trapped in their own narrative of moral superiority. Or consider how you respond to personal failures. When you fall short of your goals, do you face this reality directly, or do you find someone or something to blame? The boss who doesn't recognize your talent, the circumstances that weren't fair, the system that's rigged against you. This deflection isn't just making excuses, it's resentment, the transformation of your own shortcomings into evidence of others' moral failings. It protects your ego at the cost of your growth. Even the self-improvement industry often operates through resentment. It sells you the promise of becoming what you envy in others while maintaining the comfortable fiction that your current state is not your responsibility, but the result of lacking the right technique, system, or mindset. The truly insidious aspect of resentment is that it feels like virtue. When you judge others harshly, it doesn't feel like compensation for your own insecurities. It feels like moral clarity. When you blame external circumstances for your failures, it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like accurate assessment. This is why mastering resentment is so difficult. It requires recognizing that your most righteous judgments, your deepest moral certainties, may be symptoms of your psychology rather than perceptions of objective reality. But what would a life beyond resentment look like? How do you apply Nietzsche's final rule, not just to understanding your condition, but to transforming it? It begins with what Nietzsche called the courage for truth, the willingness to question your own certainties, especially those that feel most morally unquestionable. It means asking, what in me needs this judgment to be true? What weakness am I trying to transform or conceal? In practical terms, this might mean, when you feel moral outrage on social media, pausing to ask what underlying emotions, envy, inadequacy, fear, might be finding expression through your righteous judgment. When you find yourself harshly criticizing others, examining what qualities in them trigger your judgment. Often, we most strongly condemn in others what we cannot accept in ourselves. When you feel compelled to signal your virtue publicly, questioning what insecurity might be driving this need for external validation of your goodness. When you blame circumstances for your failures, asking what responsibility you might be avoiding through this externalization. This isn't about abandoning moral judgment entirely. It's about ensuring your judgments arise from genuine values rather than from psychological compensation for feelings of inadequacy. The person who masters resentment doesn't lack moral convictions. They simply derive those convictions from affirmation rather than negation, from creation rather than reaction. They judge not to elevate themselves above others, but to express values they've consciously chosen. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are, discovering the values that are genuinely yours rather than those you've adopted reactively. It means creating meaning rather than finding it, determining values rather than having them determined by what you oppose. The reward for this difficult work is what Nietzsche called the great health, a psychological condition beyond the need for comforting illusions or external enemies, a state where you can affirm life exactly as it is, including its suffering, without needing to blame others for your condition. In this state, you're no longer weak, not because you dominate others, but because you're no longer dominated by your own unacknowledged resentment. You've achieved what Nietzsche considered the highest human possibility: genuine self-determination. So where do we go from here? How do we move from understanding resentment to overcoming it? The path begins with radical honesty, not just about the world, but about yourself. This means developing what Nietzsche called suspicion, the capacity to question your own certainties, especially those that feel most morally unquestionable. Start by examining your judgments. When you find yourself condemning others, pause and ask, what function does this judgment serve in my psychology? Does it elevate me? Does it simplify a complex reality? Does it protect me from acknowledging my own shortcomings? This isn't about abandoning all judgment. It's about ensuring your judgments arise from genuine values rather than from psychological compensation for feelings of inadequacy. Next, examine your desires. What do you want, and why do you want it? How much of what you pursue is chosen freely, and how much is reactive, driven by comparison, social expectation, or the need to compensate for felt inadequacy? True freedom doesn't mean freedom from desire. It means desires that are genuinely yours rather than implanted by advertising, social media, or the need to keep up with others. Then, consider your identity. How much of who you think you are is defined by what you oppose? How much of your sense of self depends on having an enemy, an other against which you define yourself? The person beyond resentment doesn't lack identity. They simply derive that identity from affirmation rather than negation, from what they create rather than what they oppose. Perhaps most importantly, examine your relationship with suffering. Resentment begins with the inability to acknowledge pain without transforming it into blame. The first step beyond resentment is developing the capacity to experience suffering without needing to find someone responsible for it. This doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means distinguishing between addressing external causes of suffering and the psychological need to transform suffering into evidence of others' moral failings. The practical application of Nietzsche's final rule might look like this. When scrolling social media, notice the subtle envy that arises and acknowledge it directly rather than transforming it into moral judgment of others. When facing personal failure, resist the temptation to blame external circumstances. Ask instead, what can I learn from this? How can I use this as fuel for growth? When engaged in political discourse, check whether your position is primarily defined by what you affirm or by what you oppose. Are you creating values or merely reacting against others? When in conflict with loved ones, address specific behaviors rather than making character judgments. Replace "you're selfish" with "I felt hurt when you did X." When consuming news and information, notice when content is designed to trigger resentment, the intoxicating rush of moral superiority over a villainized other, and choose sources that inform without exploiting this psychological mechanism. None of this is easy. Resentment is not just a personal failing, but a structural feature of our psychology and society. The entire attention economy is built on exploiting this mechanism. Social media, news outlets, political campaigns, and advertising all profit from triggering and amplifying resentment. But becoming aware of this manipulation is the first step toward freedom from it. Once you recognize how resentment operates in your psychology, you can begin to choose rather than merely react. This is Nietzsche's final rule in practice. Master resentment, or forever remain a slave. Not just to others, but to your own unacknowledged psychological mechanisms. The reward for this difficult work is what Nietzsche called the Great Noon, a moment of perfect clarity where you see your task, to move beyond reaction into genuine creation, to determine your own values rather than having them determined by what you oppose. In this state, you're no longer weak, not because you dominate others, but because you're no longer dominated by your own unacknowledged resentment. You've achieved what Nietzsche considered the highest human possibility: genuine self-determination. So here's your call to action. For 1 week, commit to examining your judgments. When you find yourself condemning others, pause and ask, what function does this judgment serve in my psychology? Does it compensate for something I'm unwilling to face in myself? Don't try to stop judging. That's not the point. The goal is to become aware of the psychological origins of your judgments rather than assuming they arise from pure moral insight. This simple practice, bringing awareness to the operation of resentment in your daily life, is the first step towards mastering it. And mastering resentment is the key to never being weak again. Not weak in the sense of lacking power over others. Nietzsche had no interest in that kind of strength. But weak in the sense of having your actions determined by reaction rather than creation, by opposition rather than affirmation, by what you fear and resent rather than by what you genuinely value. Nietzsche's final rule offers no easy comfort. It doesn't promise that life will become painless or that you'll never experience inadequacy, envy, or resentment again. What it offers is something more valuable, the possibility of no longer being governed by these emotions, of transforming them into fuel for growth rather than for self-deception. The choice, as always, is yours. You can continue living reactively, allowing unacknowledged resentment to shape your judgments, desires, and identity. Or you can embark on the difficult but rewarding path of mastering it, and in doing so, discover what genuine strength might mean. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, Nietzsche wrote. Resentment hasn't killed us, but it has made us weak, individually and collectively. Mastering it might finally allow us to discover what strength really means,